Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
I'm seeing a message that says tap for sound. Should I touch it?
Salam, hello, welcome to you all. Peace to everyone out there. Welcome to Office Hours. I'm Adnan Husain. This is a weekly live stream program where we discuss topics of interest that are relevant and have some guests usually to bring their expertise and knowledge and to create an opportunity for your questions, comments, and discussion. And I really have been enjoying that component and aspect of it, the chance to engage and interact with you. And it just makes it a little bit richer and more exciting. And I think my guests have typically also really appreciated that component and dimension. And this week is no different in that I have a wonderful guest that you already knew about because we had a poster, but we also have a special bonus guest. So this is a blockbuster edition of Office Hours where we have two experts engaging in a really important topic. So the theme or the title for today's discussion is Manifest Empire, U.S. and Latin America. And I was kind of playing with of an important book called How to Hide an Empire that Daniel Immerwahr published, and trying to reverse the point in a way to say that if you haven't seen this hidden empire, which is hiding in plain sight, I think you haven't been paying attention. It's a very manifest empire, and it's been no more obvious over the last few weeks with some developments that have taken place. And that's why we're going to be having this edition to talk about it. And to help us and to answer your questions and to engage in discussion, we have Professor Alex Aviña from Arizona State University. He's a scholar of Mexican history and more broadly of Latin America and the Caribbean. And he's author of Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. Welcome, Alex. It's great to have you back on. You've been on Guerrilla History, and you've been a generous participant in the Adnan Husain show several times. So welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
No, thank you, Adnan, for the invitation. Always happy to be here.
Terrific. And then in addition, we also have Joe Emmersberger, who is joining us. And I think we'll be talking about an article that you wrote recently. And I'm so glad that you could come on for the first time for Office Hours and on the show. You are co-author of Extraordinary Threat, the U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. And as a journalist have published your work, Mint Press, News, Fair, .org, Counterpunch, ZNet, and Telesur English, Twitter, all great resources and outlets for people. Joe, it's great to have you on. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Well, okay, so to sort of set the stage, and before I do that, I just want to remind everybody who's here in, on YouTube or on Twitter, if you could like this live stream video, share it on your social media. I like to say, don't be parsimonious. This is wonderful material and access to great scholarly and intellectual and journalistic insight, information, and analysis. Share it with your comrades, your friends, colleagues, even your enemies. They need to be learning, more about what's going on in this world. So maybe you can also subscribe to the channel so that you find out and get notifications about future episodes. We do this weekly. We have a monthly struggle session, which is a live stream panel discussion with a few guests. And also, if you want to support and keep my absent producer, appropriately compensated, you can always, of course, go to patreon.com/Adnan Husain or do a one-time gift, buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Husain. But as we've been doing recently, really, I want to encourage you to give to people in Gaza. There are a lot of individual appeals out there. You know them, you see them on social media. Please be generous. This is a desperate situation. But I would also suggest that you go to lifelineforgaza.com, where you can come across some of the appeals that aren't getting as much attention and help support them. And I always encourage people to do collective mutual aid support that provides infrastructure for the continued existence of life of Palestinians in Gaza on their land by supporting the Samir Project. So go find them and go support those worthy causes. Okay, but to our topic, a lot has been happening, and so I wanted to get your sense, especially perhaps particularly about this attack that happened earlier in September, where a small boat was attacked and sunk, to much crowing by the Trump administration. Let's set the stage. Tell us a little bit about it, and then we can kind of broaden into the history that both of you know so well about U.S. hostility towards Venezuela. Wondering, Joe, maybe you might want to start us off, since you wrote an article recently about exactly this attack and the context of U.S. regime change operations.
Yeah, Donald Trump basically really he was euphorically, he announced he had blown up a boat in the Caribbean, a small boat with apparently killed. This is by their story. There are different versions, but just taking them at their word, what they did came to do was perpetrate an extrajudicial execution, and in the Caribbean, and apparently blew up a boat that they said was bringing drugs from Venezuela to states. And they proudly announced that they blew it up, and that there's more to come. Trump basically said there's more of this to come, and you'll see what we do next. And very ominously, very, very, very openly threatening. But it was especially striking that he bragged about committing a crime. They didn't. There was no attempt to seize the boat. There was no attempt to capture the people, and which obviously the United States has the capacity to capture a small boat. It was just we killed them, and we're proud, and we're going to do more of this. That was the message. He made no apology. There was no finesse about it. This was just putting. And then along with that, there was a massive naval buildup in the off the near Venezuela, and there's up to like these this buildup includes up to like 4,500 U.S. troops. And so so it's a warning. It has people talking. Are they going to invade? But the point that Roger Harris and I made when we wrote an article a while back is that the thing that we fear the most is what we've seen throughout West Asia, with the United States and Israel engaging in assassinations and major decapitation strikes, like they did against Hezbollah, like they did against Iran, like they've done just recently against Hamas in Qatar, and as they've done, they recently Israel proudly assassinated the Yemen's prime minister. So this is in the post Holocaust in Gaza world that we live in. It's like the propaganda component of what they do is almost minimal. It's just, we're going to do this, and we don't care what you think about it. We're just gonna we're going to do what we want, and you can't stop us. And that's basically the message. And not only to the world, but even domestic. The message is, what are you going to do about it? You try to do anything about it, we're going to get you fired. We're going to get you arrested or deported, or there's going to that's the message. So it's open challenge, I guess, to everybody to what are you going to do to stop us? And of course, the part of this brazenness that everything, as we showed in the article, all the data you can get from the UN, from the U.S. government's own drug enforcement agencies, is that the illegal drug flow from Venezuela is minuscule. it's like 5% of the drugs that make it illegal drugs that make it north to the United States comes from Venezuela. Overwhelmingly, it's always come from Colombia. Now more so from Ecuador, because they've had 7 years since 2017. It's like more like 8 years now of right wing U.S. backed rule. And they've turned the country into a major drug lord paradise. Basically, they're running rampant. They're coordinating their shipments from jails. Even, I mean, it's an absolute disaster for the population, especially with the violence, everything that's taken off there. So yeah, it's but they don't seem to care about how ridiculous their claims are. They don't like, well, and in fact, Rubio sitting in Ecuador, in this major drug trafficking hub, he said to a reporter who brought up a lot of these stats I mentioned, he said, "I don't care what the UN says." Just again, this total brazenness that we don't care if our story sucks, if it doesn't even stand up, we don't care. We're just going to do it. And what are you going to do? And by the way, if you try to do something, you're going to be the one who's afraid, not us. We have no fear, no regard for the law or for anything. So that's where they're at, and it's quite horrifying.
Yes, and I mean, Jamie put in the comments, the mask has come off where they proudly boast of murder for the world to see. The quiet part is now really loud. Yeah, I would say it's, thunderous, with these recent statements and actions. And I just want to tell listeners that the article in question here that you collaborated on with Roger Harris is titled "All Elements in Place for a U.S. Decapitation Strike on Venezuela. Decapitation of an enemy's leadership has become a tactic for the U.S.-Israeli partnership." And I think that's kind of an issue, a connection that you draw that I think is a very interesting and important one that I think also Alex probably has a lot to say, as well as other remarks on this. So Alex, what are your initial thoughts about this situation of the narco-terrorist threat that was eliminated by our fearless leader?
Oh, so many thoughts. Well, for one, I think it's always useful to start by saying that the U.S. is the world's largest narco state in a variety of different ways. We constitute something between 3 to 5% of the world's population, but we consume like 80 to 90% of the world's licit and illicit opioids, right? So like there's something obviously wrong within the core of U.S. empire that has created this insatiable demand for licit and illicit drugs for about a century now. I mean, I think it's also useful to go way back and to think about how you have certain familial dynasties in the US that like became rich, became wealthy because they were involved in the drug trade. And here I'm talking about the maternal familial background of someone like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Delanos became really wealthy in part because they were smuggling opium into China in the 1830s and 1840s, right? So there's like a long U.S. tradition of familial dynasties becoming rich in that way. So it's always interesting for me to see the U.S., because it is an empire, it has the power to dictate which country represents a narco state and which country represents an ally to the U.S. in the so-called war on drugs, a war that's never about drugs. It's a war against poor people. It's a war against governments that are deemed enemies to U.S. imperial geopolitical designs, whether it's in Latin America and the Caribbean or in other parts of the world. I mean, this is what we see with Venezuela today. It is very obvious that there is no such thing, most likely, of a cartel of the suns that supposedly President Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela is the head of. One of the first instances that we learn about the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, it's actually like it was a CIA-run operation in the late 80s, early 90s, in which the CIA worked with one particular Venezuelan general who was actually the head of Venezuela's anti-narcotics unit. They worked together to traffic tons of cocaine into the United States. Now, the idea from the perspective of the CIA was that they were going to allow this operation, they were going to facilitate and allow this operation to continue so they could trace kind of like the sources of cocaine back to Colombia and back to the Medellin, the different smugglers that compromise this like Medellin confederation of narco traffickers that was made famous by Pablo Escobar. So the CIA worked with this Venezuelan general that appointed himself as the head of something called the Cartel of the Suns, El Cartel de los Soles, and they moved a lot of cocaine into the United States. And for me, that one example that I think more people should know about, because this is precisely the indictment that the U.S. is using today to go after Nicolás Maduro. Like that story of the late 80s, early 90s is emblematic of a broader history of U.S. so-called war on drugs in Latin America, particularly after World War II. They tend to identify governments that they deem to be enemies of the United States to be narco-trafficking or narco states. Meanwhile, their pliant allies, the ones who are actually moving weight, the ones who could be accused of being narco states in some capacity, while their sins are kind of looked to, there's no follow-up because they are deemed to be allies of the United States. And this goes back to, during the 1950s, it was China. After the Chinese Revolution, it was quote unquote Red China that was poisoning the United States with dope. In the 1960s, it becomes Cuba, revolutionary Cuba under the M26 movement. They became the so-called narco traffickers. When in actuality, the Cuban Revolution wiped out what had been a really the locus of illicit narco trafficking in Latin America. The revolution wiped that out, and Cuban narco traffickers had to go to other parts of Latin America to set up shop. In the late 70s and early 80s, they started accusing Sandinista Nicaragua of doing the same thing. And that's one of the most egregious ones, right? Because it was actually the U.S. working with the Contras to destabilize the Sandinista government. It was actually the allies of the U.S. who were engaged in illicit narco trafficking to fund their covert death squad tactics against the Sandinistas. So this is just part of a long tradition, long history of the U.S. Going after governments that they don't like, accusing them of being narco states. But the actual narco states, if they are U.S. allies, they're given free rein, at least momentarily, to operate until the U.S. sees their utility as extinguished. And then they may just overthrow these people like they did to Manuel Noriega in Panama in the late 80s, or more recently when they actually went after and arrested Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president of Honduras in the 2010s.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a really long history. I think it's really important to point out what you started with, that the U.S. is the biggest narco state, and that history going back to the 19th century of opioid trade, in East Asia, that a lot of the family wealth, is from these kinds of quasi-legal, downright illegal, but certainly unethical and immoral exploitative trade. Many of the first families of the United States, of course, were merchants, which was, in certain eras, really just a polite way of saying pirates and, black marketeers and so on. So, but, I wanted to come back to this question of particularly Venezuela and, why Venezuela has such a target. And, one point about this is obviously to look at the nature of the kind of Bolivarian revolution under Hugo Chavez and successively, where they stand in the kind of Latin American environment, and how it represents something of a challenge to U.S. Hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And I'm thinking here that we're witnessing and watching like the Monroe Doctrine from the early, mid 19th century that announced, under the then President Monroe, this kind of doctrine that none of the old colonial powers should be involved in the Western Hemisphere, because this was the province of the U.S. That we're seeing something that never disappeared, of course, but given the geopolitics of U.S. empire and its vicissitudes, one might say, its long period of decline since the 1990s after the Cold War, that this has created a political dynamic and opportunities for resistant movements, populist movements, socialist movements to contest U.S. hegemony, especially. I would argue, and I actually did, and then Tariq Ali actually wrote a whole book about it, which was in a way that the U.S. global war on terror, its involvements in West Asia, and particularly the invasion of Iraq, sort of sapped attention, resources, that opened up space, for resistant populist movements in Latin America that sometimes might have been crushed more quickly, perhaps, or it's a thesis. So I don't know if it's true, but there is a kind of geopolitical analysis here to do that kind of connects what Joe had been saying about the way in which U.S. tactics and approaches, U.S.-Israeli tactics and approaches, really, in some ways, do connect a larger picture of the region of Latin America within U.S. empire with West Asia. And that's a very interesting analysis. And we've had conversations before with you, Alex, where you've talked a little bit about Israeli involvement in Latin America. So I'm just wondering if, we might think of the larger kind of geopolitical connections and talk a little bit more about the entanglements and intersections between what we're seeing happening in Latin America now and U.S. policies and practices of imperial intervention in West Asia. And we could maybe start a little bit more with those decapitation strikes and assassination, but maybe talk a little bit more about what some of the patterned relationships here are. I wonder who'd like to kind of begin on that topic. Maybe, Joe, why don't we go to you, since you started with this article about looking at some of these practices, like precisely the decapitation strikes.
Yeah, well, about the thesis that that Iraq sapped resources that might have opened up space in Latin America, I think there's probably some truth in that. I mean, United States does not have infinite resources or capacity, and also it is in relative decline. There's an analysis I'm really fond of by Glenn Ford when he talked about in 2014, the late Glenn Ford, he talked about how the U.S. is in relative decline. It's going to have to roll the dice more. He saw Iraq as the U.S. rolling the dice. Becoming more assertive, but more willing to take risks. Kind of, and people say, the mask is coming off. Well, in a way, they've taken it off because they feel like they have to be more assertive as they lose relative power. That was basically Glenn Ford's argument. I think that makes sense. But if you look around the world, yeah, the United States, even very small, like Haiti. Or Nicaragua, where you can't point to any big resource, any massive resource like you have in Venezuela. Still, the United States does not have this complacency. They're not complacent. They try to. They want to get control everywhere they can. I mean, Justin Podur, in his book about the DR wars in the Congo and in the DR Congo, he talked about the fact that he just you look at how much energy they put into controlling the politics of countries in Africa, extremely poor, that could at best would never be able to be a massive supplier of and not, sometimes they have massive resources, but sometimes they don't, and the United States still gets their hands in there as much as they can. They just have this pathological fear of any place in the globe not being within their control. And that mentality, there's really no such thing as a backwater that they don't care about. They really want it all. They have that's the imperial mindset, that we have to control everything, and they're losing, and they don't have it, and they're losing it, and so they're getting more aggressive and taking more risks. And that's why I think the propaganda component has become so shoddy, compared to maybe what it was in the 80s. If you lived through the Cold War, you remember the interventions in Latin America, they constantly framed it as we're defending ourselves against the Soviets, right? But and they still have this self-defense thing, but it seemed to me like it was much. They paid more attention to it. They really seemed to care more that people believe that. Now it doesn't seem like they really care that people believe it. I mean, for example, this drug thing that they're coming up with now is that this wasn't. I mean, Justin and I wrote our book looking very detailed at the propaganda from 1998 to 2021 on Venezuela. I mean, that's what our book was about, and drugs played no part of it. I mean, it was minuscule. There was really no part of it. There was no effort to convince people that Venezuela was, flooding the United States with drugs. It just wasn't there. It only started in 2020 when under Trump that the decision was made that we're going to change the script now. Before, it was all about we got to rescue Venezuela from this tyrant who's creating a humanitarian crisis. Look, it was even when Trump did his 2019 aid stunt on the Colombian border, it was all about you got to let this aid in, and generals disobey Maduro. Don't listen to him. Let the aid in. It was all about this story that they were rescuing Venezuela and bringing back democracy and ending the humanitarian crisis. And Trump just flipped the script. He decided, now you know what? Now we're going to go to like they're flooding us with drugs, and it was really it's almost comical how the media starts taking seriously a story that just because the White House changes the script, it becomes taken seriously all of a sudden. Like it's reported with minimal scrutiny. Maybe Venezuela is flooding us with drugs. So it's just it's I think a shoddy propaganda, but it seems like as they take more risks, I don't think they can use as much they can devote as much care to propaganda or getting people to believe it. It's more like they just want you to be afraid to oppose it, and I think that relates back to the loss of relative power and the need to be more aggressive, and they just don't have the capacity to use that much finesse anymore.
Right, and I mean, it sounds like the differences, you might say, in terms of the propagandistic fear-mongering really are just the different metaphors used by, the palette. There's a different, more refined palette around like liberal values and liberal order. So we'll rationalize this as authoritarian rule that needs to be, stopped, and it's creating, as you said, a humanitarian disaster because there's some sort of politics of, humanitarian intervention that's available in that sort of a discourse. Whereas, with the Trump administration, it's a, different kind of concerns. And so they rationalize it just in a different way. I mean, there's this kind of sense that immigrants are coming and we need to, mobilize around all of the threats that happen when immigrants come and change the character of the U.S. society. So it's always that these, threats come from outside, and so in this case, then it's the drugs are coming in from the outside. And so this is a threat and a danger to America. So it's like America First's version of how to rationalize empire. It's still going to be an empire, even if it's, America First. But I am interested in the issue, whether there is a kind of conscious recalibration and recognition of the limits of U.S. power, not for any, kind of sense of trying to normalize their relationship, with the rest of the world. There's still American exceptionalism. But, Pete Hegseth a few months ago basically was giving speeches and public remarks that suggested, we probably don't have the might to really take on China in current conditions, and these wars in West Asia, we have to deal with them and try and get over them, and that there might be a kind of neo-Monrovian kind of hunker down in an area of longer historic intervention and control that's also closer. And so you're not as stretched in terms of, resources having to be sent to these, 800 bases around the world, but, focus where you can bring power to bear. And so I wonder if that's a kind of recalibration that's consciously taking place as a response to the fact that there are limits to U.S. power, and everywhere they have tried to extend themselves, they encounter resistance that is extremely costly, difficult to deal with, and so forth. And one could even look back to the Afghanistan, withdrawal and redeployment that was characterized at the time in a very optimistic way is that, well, we will have to reposition vis-a-vis China. But I think they're recognizing that's really not a very realistic, goal for American empire. But Alex, what do you think about this kind of question?
I think about it a couple of ways. One, so I think about the historical reference that Trump has used or kind of deployed to understand his thinking on foreign policy. I mean, thinking is kind of a little too generous for Trump, but nonetheless, like Trump 1, Trump 2, like he's talked about the 1920s and he's talked about the McKinley era, right? So it's interesting to think about his definition of isolationism and America first correlates to a period of US history where presidents also said that the US was pursuing an isolationist America first policy from, let's say, the end of the Spanish American War up until the early 1930s. And unfortunately for to this day, you have very serious international relations people and even some US historians who will still tell you that US isolationism is an actual thing that existed historically, actually in practice. Whereas what we know from a Latin American perspective is that from 1900 to 1933, the US invaded Latin America 34 times using the US Marines. So anytime that for me at least as a historian of Latin America, anytime I hear a politician or a political leader like Trump say we are pursuing an isolationist agenda, I know that's going to be bad news for Latin America. Because U.S. isolationism is, like you described, Adnan, a retrenchment of U.S. empire in the Western Hemisphere. The question is, how do you apply or how do you implement this attempt to enact the application of the Monroe Doctrine? And there's also a corollary to that. And one of the figures I think historically that speaks to this is Teddy Roosevelt, right? And his ideas of like martial masculinity, like how there was a crisis of U.S. white bourgeois masculinity. Like how can white middle-class men recover that martial masculinity? Well, they go abroad and they do empire work and they attack Latin America for 3 decades. I hear traces of that in what Hegseth, when his whole in his discourse about being the Department of War and that he's overseeing warriors. Like there's some sort of crisis of masculinity happening again within certain demographics of white men. Well, let's say, just say it, white men in the U.S. perhaps, and some of the allies that they've managed to recruit into their expanded definition of whiteness, and they're trying to become warriors. And like in the past, they're going to use Latin America and the Caribbean as the area where they get to exercise this imperial martial masculinity. So that's one way to understand it, right? But the thing that happened in the first 3 decades of the 20th century that Trump and his people should be anticipating or should be thinking about is that all those U.S. interventions generated really important instances, revolutionary instances of resistance in Latin America against U.S. empire, to the point where someone like the historian Greg Grandin would say Latin America saved the U.S. from itself. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 and Augusto Cesar Sandino's guerrilla revolution in Nicaragua in the late 20s and early 30s against the U.S. Marines taught American politicians that this type of imperial work was too expensive, politically, militarily, and in terms of like human cost. And Grandin makes the argument that it was Latin American resistance that taught someone like FDR that like the good neighbor policy should be something that they pursue. It was still somewhat imperialistic, but at the very least, the United States was not going to be directly intervening militarily in Latin America, right? So there's always a reaction from Latin America. Now, the question is whether U.S. politicians are smart enough or nimble enough to take that lesson. And we cannot trust FDR and his brain. We cannot compare FDR and his brain trust. People who actually had long experience working in places like Mexico and other parts of Latin America, that simply does not exist today in Trump and the people around him. So what I think they're going to do is they're going to try to continue to exercise some sort of very direct, overt U.S. military imperial control over Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is going to, once again, engender some sort of resistance and pushback. And people are, this can lead, I don't want to like glorify this or kind of like idealize it because it is going to cause mass human suffering. It's hard for me to fathom. And I don't even want to think about what would happen if the U.S. tries to invade a place like Venezuela, or if they try to do military actions in a place like Mexico, which they have been talking about for 3-4 years now. Like the human catastrophe, the potential human catastrophe would be horrible. The other way to think about this is that, and this is something that I've learned in the past 10, 15 years, I've learned from from our comrade Nick Estes and from Native American history, is that the question of U.S. empire abroad in the Latin America, in the Caribbean, is intimately connected to the beginnings of U.S. empire here, right, with settler colonialism, right? Even someone like Frederick Jackson Turner, the U.S. historian who developed the idea of the frontier thesis, he has a really interesting quote in a speech where he said the germ of the Monroe Doctrine actually began in the Ohio Valley, right? That first instance post-American independence push into indigenous lands in the Ohio Valley, which began an unbroken process of imperial expansion and genocide against indigenous peoples throughout the rest of what is now the United States. Right. So there is an intimate relationship between the exercise of U.S. imperial power abroad and what they're doing domestically. And one way to understand this is to think about the border that exists is a Mexico-Palestine border. Like, that idea to me really captures what the U.S. is doing abroad in sponsoring, financing, arming a genocide in Palestine, but then using some of those same justifications and logics in the Caribbean by exterminating 11 people that were on a boat, or by applying those ethnic cleansing logics to undocumented migrant communities in the United States. Like, those two things are intimately connected. And that's, I try to keep trying to balance both things in my head as I try to analyze what this military buildup in the Caribbean represents.
Yeah, very interesting point. I want to come back to that and maybe explore it further with you two and talk a little bit about also some of those resonances between U.S. policy in West Asia and what's happening here, in the context of Latin America. But before diving further into that, there's been some very interesting questions and remarks and a discussion in the chat. And I want to raise one point that came up. But before doing that, if you're on Twitter, you should, one, retweet the stream, but also if you want to get involved in the actual discussion, which is really popping a lot of great comments and questions, being made there, come over to the YouTube stream so that you can participate in that. I mean, it's fine if you want to watch, that's great, but if you want to participate and engage with comrades, colleagues, and pose questions for the panel and so on, come on over to the YouTube. And I see some wonderful returning guests and returning commenters and colleagues. Sasha Rambouts from Resistance's Fertile podcast, a great comrade, a wonderful podcast, and a lot of other familiar names in the chat. So we're building some kind of sense of community. But I wanted to come to David Schmid, who's a colleague. He's been a guest on the Majlis, a previous podcast, and maybe we'll have him on Office Hour someday soon. Asked about the question of drugs. That he says, I would very much like to hear y'all's thoughts about the causes of the huge demand for illicit drugs in the U.S. So it's not exactly our Latin America topic, but, it's an interesting issue. And he went on with my prompting to, say that he comes back to what William Burroughs had to say, his insight on drugs as, in essence, the logical endpoint of capitalism, and pointed out further that he put it in Naked Lunch: junk is the ideal product, the ultimate merchandise. No sales talk necessary. The client will crawl through a sewer and beg to buy. So this is like the ideal product and the ideal consumer relationship in consumer capitalism. And it elicited a lot of other interesting remarks. I mean, Sasha said people, in the empire need the drugs to cope with being beneficiaries of colonization. So something about what you were talking about, Alex, this settler colonial condition produces a lot of morbidities and, kind of all kinds of real problems, psychically, emotionally, socially, and so on. And in some sense, the anomie of capitalism combined with the, destructive, bloody memories, really, of the process of founding and continuing to govern and expand this nation also produces its own kind of social ills, psychic ills that sometimes turn to drugs might be, a consequence of that process. And so there were a lot of other, great comments. I'm just wondering what you all think of that before we sort of go back outward into discussing U.S. empire in Latin America. What are those sort of boomerang effects, perhaps, on society in the United States? How do we explain this rather pervasive use of illicit drug? Well, we shouldn't just say illicit drugs, because of course it's also the prescription drugs. You were pointing out the opioids, are sometimes legal and abused, and a way of coping as well. So, why so dependent?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that. It's a great point. I don't have a great answer. I just note that, somebody said that it's the nature of capitalism, but a lot of countries are capitalists that don't have that problem, not with drug use, not the way the United States has. In fact, I saw recently that I think Trump asked the Mexican president, why don't you guys have this problem with you guys have these cartels, but you don't have the drug use. Like, it's all going north, right? So despite being capitalist, it seems like a lot of countries, if their societies are more social, more family oriented, less alienated, less lonely, it seems like some of those dysfunctions are avoided.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
go ahead, Alex.
It's interesting. Your colleague David, that the quote from William Burroughs, like Antonio Gramsci had a similar take, like in the before he was arrested. He talked about, I'm going to paraphrase it, but he like talks about how cocaine was somehow an index of like bourgeois civilization. Like there was something like, I think he was thinking about cocaine being like a stimulant, like, and related to like increased productivity. But I still think it's a really interesting point if we think about it beyond just the economic base, and to think about it on civilizational terms, in terms of what does it say about our contemporary age, that drugs of choice tend to be downers, right? They numbing, they check you out. But I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, some of this we can really place the blame on a certain generation, the boomers. I mean, there is, like, if in the long scope of 20th century, there's always been licit and illicit drug use in the United States, but it's really the 60s where you see a demand just completely, like, exponentially become industrialized and massified, that then has all sorts of effects in the global South, where in places where they were growing marijuana or opium poppies that would have to be processed into things like heroin. So that's like globally, that's a really important moment, like the early 1960s to today. And what we see is just you see more or less consistent rates of illicit drug use, but the drug of choice will change. And I think that's really interesting. I have a colleague here at ASU who published a really interesting book a couple of years ago, Ben Fong. It's called Quick Fixes. I highly recommend it. And each chapter treats like a different drug type, and then that allows him to kind of trace the history of like drug use and drug war in the United States. And the final chapter is really interesting because his solution is a social democratic one. Like, if you give people good jobs, good healthcare, and a home, like, that will go a long way with mitigating some of these horrific drug usage and drug consumption issues in the United States. I mean, part of this has to do with the fact that we live in like the most savage capitalist nation. So, right, we're not the only capitalist nation, but we are like the paradigm, right? Trump has spent so many years talking about how it's migrants and the evil brown men who are trafficking drugs into the United States and poisoning poor white Americans. Well, we know that like 80 to 90% of people who are caught smuggling fentanyl into the United States are American citizens. And a lot of these people are like it's hard luck, man. They're like they're doing this to either satiate their own usage and or to make ends meet. Like, I've read interviews of people saying, look, I decided to drive to Mexico and bring over a shipment. I worked with people who set me up to do this because I the actual issue.
Okay, my stream may have been a bit unstable. I hope, well, we're still up, so that's good. But we seem to be, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we're having a bit of stream issues. Hopefully it's going to go okay. And you caught what Alex was discussing.
Can I recommend a book, Adnan? Because
yeah,
I don't know if it
please.
was my stream or yours that was something was throwing me off over here. Maybe it was mine. Suzanne Reese has a book called We Sell Drugs, and it's an excellent book because she focuses not just on the illicit side, but also on U.S. efforts after World War II to control the global political economy of licit drugs. And that's a really interesting book that will really back up the thesis that the U.S. is the world's largest narco state. It's not just about illicit. It's actually how efforts to control the illicit political economy of narcotics often generates an illicit economy of narcotics, right? And the big example more recently is what happened with the Sackler family and opiates in the United States, right? And how a illicit drug there ended up, for a variety of reasons, really stimulating an illicit political economy of opioids from Mexico into the United States, right? But because the Sacklers are good capitalists, they were able to sell drugs legally for a long time, causing massive amounts of damage throughout large swaths of the United States. In many ways, it's large pharmaceuticals and families like the Sacklers that are much more dangerous than like El Chapo or any of these so-called drug kingpins that we're taught to fear.
Right. Great recommendation. So maybe to come back to the present concern about possible U.S. invasion or what's being planned here. We had one question here from, and maybe this is a good one for you, Joe, from Migdalia Arcila Valenzuela. Can we talk about the U.S. military bases in Latin America? If they want to attack Venezuela, it would be probably from Colombia, which I don't know, maybe not under the Petro government. This is an interesting little wrinkle here, something the Colombian right wing is very much on board with. And so maybe it would, have to involve some kind of like, derailing of that government. But, you mentioned in the article, Joe, and I think there was a graphic too, and I wish I was a little better and not such a kind of almost boomer technology wise, but not boomer in the cultural effects that Alex was talking about before, because it illustrated, or at least you were portraying and showing how many military resources have been deployed in the Caribbean and in this kind of encircling of Venezuela to make possible, at least, the conditions for some kind of strike and so on. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that situation, Joe.
Yeah, well, listen, I could be wrong, but I think it's more about laying the conditions, preparing the American public and the world for something to happen, for some kind of decapitation strike. Because like I think Roger and I argued, I don't think the resources they've deployed are anywhere near enough to really do what they did, for example, in Afghanistan, where they directly occupied the country for 20 years. And incidentally, it's always got to remember, like we noted, the Taliban eliminated opium production completely. It went to zero. And then under 20 years of direct military occupation by the United States, it skyrocketed. So I think there's a quote somewhere that says that, if you're fighting a war on drugs for like 50 years and you're losing, then maybe you're not really fighting a war on drugs at all. It's just a big scam. Yeah. So what I fear is some kind of decapitation strike, like we argued, like they've already done so many times. So that and they don't even, and we alluded to this too. They don't even have to really, from their point of view, from the empire's point of view, bring about install a right-wing government that does what they want. If they just produce chaos, I mean that's already a win. They just destroy the country, produce a chaos, prevent any independent development, independent foreign policy. I think that's what's terrifying here. And the other thing is the infinite timeline they have. With impunity, they can just keep trying. They've had the embargo on Cuba for 60 plus years now. Because of the level of impunity they have, they could just trying stuff, keep trying. Didn't work 2019. Oh, we'll try 2025. Oh, we'll try 2030. Until something gives, until something really, until the resistance to the empire wins a really big victory at some point, some way. They're going to keep at it. And that's really terrifying. They have this infinite line. They could just keep with it, keep with it, and really, really terrifying.
But I think they don't have time. They don't have time, right? Like, I think for so much of the history of the U.S. empire, going abroad was a way to kind of display some of the internal contradictions, right? And that's one of Trump's hallmarks, that from the first time he won, is to say, no, we're not going abroad the frontier's closed. We're setting up walls. We're setting up at the border. We are not going to displace our internal racial and class contradictions and conflicts anymore to the quote unquote frontiers abroad. We're just going to fight amongst ourselves, right? So it's interesting. I think Joe's correct. Like in a different time, the U.S. can wage a 50, 60-year war against a country like Cuba or Venezuela. But internally, I think we're in a different moment now where a lot of these contradictions are coming home. They are home. And we just saw it with the Charlie Kirk assassination. We see with increased instances of political violence. We see what ICE is doing in cities throughout the United States. We see Trump threatening and actually invading U.S. cities under the premise of crime, which is part of the war on drugs discourse. So I think part of what it's really hard to, they're so unpredictable at this point. And I think part of that unpredictability has to do with Trump and the fact that he lacks like a coherent unifying ideology. And he's got a bunch of morons around him that actually aren't very good at what they're at running a state. But part of that unpredictability has to do with the fact that the empire internally is falling apart. And the furies are not being loosened abroad, and necessarily they've been loosened domestically. And maybe this action in the Caribbean and Latin America against Venezuela is kind of this disparate, disorganized effort to kind of reorient or redirect some of these contradictions again. But I don't think time is on the side of U.S. empire. Like I think Joe and Roger's article is really interesting and also frightening, because a decapitation strike does create chaos. It does create disorder. It does create suffering without really achieving the overall goal of the U.S. government, which is regime change in Venezuela. But it still creates that chaos that then other countries in the region are going to have to react against. And there are military bases in Colombia, right? But it puts the current president of Colombia in a position where he has to go against an institution that, formed part of what Hugo Chavez was referred to as the Israel of Latin America. Like Colombia, it's only very recently that we can count Colombia as being on the left side, on being on the anti-genocide side. For decades before that, they were a really reliable U.S. ally against the pink tide, and then even before then. So I don't know. The time issue, I think this time is working against U.S. empire.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a very important point about being satisfied with chaos. And in fact, actually, that seems to be, if we were thinking again a little bit about the analogies between U.S. imperial policy in Latin America and what it has done over the last 40 years in West Asia, is, it has sown chaos, and that serves the goals of empire. It isn't just, well, we want to replace the regime and have a friendly government that looks after our interests. In many of these cases, like in what's happened in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, sowing chaos and preventing these countries from being able to organize themselves for sovereign development, and just prevent that and sow chaos. But I think one of the differences, if they do that in is that the refugee crisis that is created from it, was Europe's problem principally, right? How many people from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, North Africa came to the United States? Almost no one, right? It really was a pressure on Europe, right? And it has had important and very serious consequences on the political climate, the way that that's been exploited, for racist far right sorts of wave of political success by far right parties in Eastern Europe, but now even in mainstream politics in Western Europe. So, but if you do that in Latin America, Central America, and so on, those refugees are going to come to the U.S. And of course, that's what the migrant crisis, so-called, the crisis at the border, was created, of course, by destabilizing governments, the endless U.S. wars and intervention, the death squads, the toppling of governments, creating horrific economic conditions through sanctions, and so on, is what has created, of course, a lot of migration of people that fuels, again, right-wing sorts of politics. So there's a kind of mutually reinforcing kind of dynamic here of empire preventing development in a stable way on behalf of the people of the region, and sowing instead either neoliberal chaos in economic sorts of terms that impoverishes people, or through actual military intervention and supporting and training and supporting right-wing death squads that terrorize the population and make life impossible that way. So I'm wondering, what you think about the wider kind of situation in Latin America, because there have been some projects. We remember the so-called first pink tide, right, that happened in the 2000s, mid-late 2000s and into the early 2010s, where there were a lot of progressive, populist, socialist-oriented governments across South America, Latin America. And then there was a reaction and a response to that. And we got Bolsonaro, and we got some, and we got Milei, and now it seems that there was another kind of wave of progressive governments that included, even Colombia, which was quite extraordinary. But we're seeing in Bolivia and elsewhere that there is a real kind of reaction taking place. How do you look at what's been happening and what the prospects for, populist social development are, and especially if there is this neo-Monrovian kind of turn and focus on Latin America as the sort of proper first concentration, for U.S. empire, because it's closer to home. What do you think we need to be analyzing here in the political situation across Latin America?
Well, I think one problem has been this whole idea that you have to give fascist and U.S. subversives political rights. The pink tide governments played by those rules, and one by one they were knocked off. And mind you, and I'm not saying if they hadn't played by those rules, maybe it would. I'm not saying it would have been easy to just say, okay, for Chavez to say, okay, I'm going to really clamp down after the 2002 coup, right, and really give them what they deserve. I can't say for sure that would have turned out better, but I'm just saying that what Chavez's approach was to always be conciliatory, give the fascists basically their spaces, their newspapers, their TV channels, and their right to participate in politics, even though they're actively working with playing a role of subversives. So it's very difficult in Latin America to play by those rules and develop, because you'll have a period where you develop, then you'll take several steps backwards after a coup, like in Bolivia, or something else happens that always sets it back. Ecuador made tremendous progress under Correa in so many metrics, and now it's all been destroyed, and they're just overrun with crime. The homicide rate under Correa was it fell to like five or six per 100,000, and now it's up over 40. Since 2017. So it's always like you have these tremendous steps in development, and then they get washed back because you're trying to do politics, and you're trying to do so-called democracy under the boot of U.S. imperialism. And I think I have a little bit of a disagreement with Alex about the timeline, because when I say the impunity that gives the U.S. This infinite time to just keep trying to destabilize people. It's because there's no real prospect of anything revolutionary happening within the imperial core. That's what I think makes me think that they're going to keep this going, and I don't see it. There's always contradictions and problems, but they always seem to weaponize them. Like if they create a huge migrant crisis, then that just fuels more racism and xenophobia. It's if there's more crime or assassinations, then it's an excuse to crack down on the left. Even if it's intra-fascist violence, it's still an excuse to crack down on the left. So it's always like they create these problems, but the way they address them is always just to double down and become more fascistic than they already were. So I'm not. There is a sense, though. I mean, Marco Rubio could lose Trump's. Right now, he seems to have Trump's ear, but we've seen Trump has a history of turning on the people he hires and listens to very viciously. So who knows how long Rubio has to have Trump's ear and tell him to go after Venezuela. That could end any time, and maybe somebody will come in who's less interested and focused more on elsewhere in the world. That in that sense, there might be a lack of time. But and in the other sense too, in the longer term, the United States is like I said, as Glenn Ford I think put it best back in 2014, how it's losing relative power and therefore has to take more risks. So in that sense, their time to be as powerful enough to influence so much of the world is running out. But it's not on a time scale that's make any of us comfortable. Say, oh, they're going down. Well, no, okay, they're going down, but not in a way that anyone should be comfortable with, because they still have tremendous capacity to do tremendous damage.
Well, let me take this opportunity to say that if there are, I'm not able to check on my screen, more people watching than there are likes. Shame on all of you. Come on, like this stream so that other people will have it on their feeds and they'll come across it. We've been hearing some brilliant analysis from Joe and Alex. Share that. So again, like the stream, share it on social media, retweet it if you're watching on Twitter. And subscribe to the channel so that you find out about next week or the following week's office hours stream. There was an interesting point here from Vasco. And a question here. What do you think of the role of the Brazilian government that portrays itself as left but implements liberal economic policies, vetoed Venezuela's entrance in BRICS, and we should point out, actually nominated Argentina, under Milei, keeps selling steel to the Zionists. So how to make sense of this major power BRICS country, that has gone back and forth between, sort of left government, but then seesaw to Bolsonaro. And I wonder also, we had a very interesting episode with Michael Fox of Real News. He does these podcast audio documentaries, and he's been based in Brazil and done a lot of work on Brazil, that there is a big social, cultural, and religious change that's taking place and has been taking place in Brazil that certainly affects aspects of its political orientation and even its foreign policy, with a lot of these evangelical Christian denominations, particularly these Pentecostals. And they tend to be extremely Christian Zionists. And so that puts a certain constraint, not only on like their conservative approach perhaps to social issues, but they also are very different than the kind of social basis of historic, traditional Catholic religion, the institutions, the society, the culture, etc., which might have been conservative, but in a different sort of way. And certainly that also, affects during this period where you might have slightly more anti-capitalist type language out of liberation theology, as that's kind of declining the space for it, perhaps, which was important in the 70s and 80s in, responses to right-wing governments and articulating people's demands for, equality and social care and so on. So, what do we make of Brazil? How do you analyze it, both politically, but also maybe, in its historical, social, and cultural changes that it's been undergoing?
I'll offer a couple of thoughts. I think we have to. It's complicated, like everything. But if we think about Brazil during the beginning of the Pink Tide, they played a prominent role in the UN occupation of Haiti, right? I mean, it's the social democratic project in Brazil since the first Pink Tide till today. I mean, in relative terms, it's obviously a much better project than what the right wing in Brazil, particularly under Bolsonaro, has offered. A right wing that is Christian Zionist, that is impacted by this change in demographics and religious affiliation of a once majority Catholic nation now becoming extremely polarized religiously, that gets expressed politically as well. So one way to read Brazil today, I think, is that level of increased domestic polarization and division has an impact on the type of foreign policy that they want to implement, or vice versa too. I mean, you could think about Lula saying, okay, I recognize that my political position is actually fragile domestically. So I'm going to be, this time around in the presidency, I'm going to be very moderate, which he has been compared to his previous presidential terms, because he recognizes that he may not have the political capital and support that he once did. Then I think the way I read his foreign policy is that he uses that to kind of burnish some of his leftist credentials. But that's also a really complicated issue, because he does things like veto Venezuela's entrance into BRICS. So part of this has to do with some of the comments that Joe was saying about the Pink Tide in general, right? You had the left finally take democratic power in Latin America, but they started to operate on a political terrain and within a state form that wasn't of their making, right? The rules weren't of their making. Even though these rules were described as quote unquote democratic, were they fully democratic? No, right? So that was a constraint to the broader revolutionary project that some of these leaders had in mind that catapulted them to winning presidential elections. And also we have to step back and think about this on a global level. Like Latin America still occupies a particular place within the global economic hierarchy, and that limits what they can do, right? It limits what you can do domestically in terms of implementing radical reforms. The moment you try to implement some sort of radical reform, that may generate capital flight, and that will mess up your economy in the near term. You also have this dynamic, I think, that Joe mentioned as well, and Argentina is the paradigmatic example of this. Is the left comes in, it does some good things, it actually is very fiscally responsible, it does some of the things that the IMF wants them to do. Then they lose the next election, a right winger comes in, messes up the entire economy, creates a condition for the left to come back. The left ameliorates some of the things, but not to the expectations of the people. So then they lose the next election, and then a worse right winger comes in. And the left is always in a defensive position where they have to make up for the catastrophe, the economic and political catastrophes generated by different right-wing parties. During the 80s and 90s, I'm getting away from Brazil now, but during the 80s and 90s, one of the questions in like Latin American political science and political discourse was like, can the left be a responsible government? Can the left govern responsibly? And that was the wrong question. The question, but is particularly considering the Cold War history of the region, the question was whether the right could be a democratic, responsible force of governance. And they can't be. Like we've seen this over and over again. There is no responsible right in Latin America, even though for 3-4 decades, scholars have been looking for quote unquote the responsible left in Latin America. It was that they were looking in the wrong place for the wrong actor. There is not by accident that most of the right in Latin America has become radicalized, has become much more undemocratic, much more revanchist, and they also tend to support Israel. You will see Israel flags at all their gatherings, all their protests, all their parades. I mean, that should be a red flag. But then going back to Brazil, then I think right now, I think this latest Lula presidency, his position domestically is really weak relative to the first time he was in power. And I think that's led to a more moderate political stance internally. And maybe that's expressed itself in terms of foreign policy as well. There's also the problem of upcoming elections and whether anyone else besides Lula can win the presidency on the broader left. Is there someone else beside him that can actually win an election at the national presidential level. And that's not a question that's limited to Latin America, to Brazil. I think that's an open question throughout Latin America. The final thing I'll mention, this more region wide, is we saw this in Argentina, is a younger generation that for a variety of reasons was amenable to the type of crazy anarcho-capitalist discourses that someone like Javier Milei was espousing in Argentina. Like the level of youth support that he got to win that presidency is kind of, I mean, when I saw the result, I was frightened to a certain extent, right? You would think, oh no, it's young people. You have this like stereotype. They tend to be more open-minded, whatever, more progressive. But that election showed that something else is happening generationally, particularly at the younger level. And I think we still need to do a lot more political work and actual research to figure out what's going on at that level. And you see that expressed in other places as well. Not every place in Latin America. I think Mexico is it's a different dynamic. But I think the generational question is an important one, whether it expresses itself as who young people are willing to vote for. And then at the level of leadership, like, can you find other leaders to take power beyond just people like Lula who have, decades of capital and support and goodwill built up for them?
Yeah, those are great points, and also I'd add the whole U.S. obsession with forcing Latin Americans into term limits is precisely that, to prevent effective leadership that can actually win elections. Because if you win a few, they'll say, okay, go away, bring some, because the right wing comprador type are a dime a dozen. You can swap them in. In fact, and Ecuador is a nice example of that, because they've had 3 different right wing presidents. They all do the same thing. And their priority is to keep Rafael Correa from ever running, because they know he would. So it's preventing that. It's bad enough that they impose all these all the typical constraints of capitalism and liberal democracy, but on top of that, they want to also impose term limits to prevent you from really being able to sustain progress. Fortunately, Venezuela got out of it. Under Chavez, they eliminated the term limits, and they've come to realize through all the coup attempts that they just can't give fascist political rights, and that's why they're being tagged as a dictatorship, especially since when Maduro came in, is because they basically, and even with that, even with what they've done, they still, Juan Guaido, he was basically appointed interim president of Venezuela by Donald Trump, and he was never arrested. It's astounding when you think about it. He was this openly subversive guy who went to Washington D.C. and got a plot for Congress. He was never arrested in Venezuela. He left because he was so reviled, and Americans had given up on him. They saw that he was a loser. They wasn't going to get anything done for them, and now he lives in the United States with his stolen money. But it's just amazing how permissive even Venezuela, even the government that's tried to rein in the fascism most, maybe aside from Cuba, whole other discussion there. But an important one, because Cuba, in so many ways, is developed far beyond the rest of Latin America in so many basic indicators. It surpasses Latin America, in some cases even Canada and the United States, in infant mortality. Why? Because they haven't played by these idiotic rules of capitalism and liberal democracy that says you gotta mess everything up, to give fascists freedom. So that's a big problem.
Well, Juan Guaido was spotted at the U.S. Open, so maybe he can declare himself president of the U.S. Open and finally go away and leave Venezuela alone. I think Cuba is a really interesting case. I mean, I just read that their electric grid just like completely collapsed a couple of days ago. I mean, like that, the level of suffering that U.S. empire has enacted and waged for decades on that island country because of its defiant revolutionary messaging, action, solidarity that is actually implemented in other parts of the world is just it should be enraging. And we can say that without, you say this in let's say like more mainstream venues, and people will be like, well, Cuba's done this, Cuba's done, yeah, whatever. There's internal contradictions in every government. Every government makes mistakes. But this government is not allowed to make mistakes on its own terms. This government has not been allowed to make its own mistakes and figure out its own solutions in a regional context that doesn't involve constant covert and overt U.S. economic and military warfare against it. Like that's what national sovereignty and self-determination is supposed to be. If a country enjoys national sovereignty and self-determination, they have the freedom to fuck up, but then they also have the freedom to fix it on their own terms without having an empire constantly intervening to prevent them from doing so, to push them to take certain approaches just to defend those two principles. And I think that's the broader question. The broader question for Latin America is, can this region ever exercise fully national sovereignty and self-determination when the U.S. empire exists? One way historically that has been articulated by certain intellectuals and revolutionaries is for a pan-Latin Americanism, right? This goes back to Simón Bolívar. It goes back to José Martí, Fidel Castro. There's all these revolutionary thinkers and leaders who have articulated this idea, which would be one way to counteract the effects of U.S. empire. But U.S. empire has always been very nimble and smart when it comes to using divide and conquer strategies. Yeah. As the great Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano said, these Latin American countries, at their worst moments, they're idiot countries trained to dislike one another when we actually share a lot in common. And we actually share one common enemy, which is U.S. empire, right? But that's always been the struggle within Latin America. Can it, as a region, individual countries are not ever strong enough to countenance or keep U.S. empire at bay, except for Cuba, and we see the consequences of that, some very tragic consequences of that. So the response should be some sort of regional unity against the U.S. and that's always the hope. There's brief moments, we've seen it, but not long enough and not strong enough, right? The pink tide was one potential moment where you saw that, but even during the pink tide, Mexico was on the right and Colombia was on the right. And those two countries would have been a great help for creating some sort of, to enacting and creating the type of regional unity that people like Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, and others were imagining as a way to keep U.S. empire at bay. It's an ongoing question. For me, that's the thing I keep thinking about. How can this entire region come together? Can they find a way to somehow come together as the way to countenance and defend themselves against U.S. empire? The other question that started to become an important one during the first pink tide was the rising economic power of China. And with the exception of Mexico, the entire region's number one trade partner is China. So that also explains, I think, the freak out during Trump 1, during the Biden administration, and during Trump 2. They more or less had the same policies and ideas against China being in Latin America. So one way that some Latin American countries had to countenance or push back against U.S. empire was to increase their trade relationship with China. And it's been pretty successful in that regard. But can they go beyond that? Can they actually become more united internally as a way to kind of push off Latin America? I think we saw Petro saying push off against the U.S. empire. We saw Petro make statements that if something happens to Venezuela, Colombia would back up Venezuela against the U.S. I mean, I think that would be it's a really powerful gesture and discursively. If it comes to it having to be implemented in actuality in material terms, that would be even stronger. And I think that's the type of thinking that the region needs.
That was very nice to hear, I have to say. But seriously, Colombia has 7 military bases, U.S. military bases on its soil until the government kicks them out, the way Korea kicked out the U.S. military base in Ecuador. Until something like that happens, it's hard to believe. Like it's a nice thing to say, but it's hard to believe that anything would come of it, that the military would even obey him, even if he really stuck his neck out and say, hey, we have to fight the gringos. I don't know that they'd listen to him. Another thing I just want to mention, so much to criticize Lula for. I mean, I'm not a fan at all. I really don't. Because of the existence of China and even Russia now, I really can't buy excuses from him. Any excuse, but he did just recently under Lula with Bolsonaro was sentenced, and also one of the generals who committed a major massacre in Haiti during the occupation was also sentenced. So that's great. But like we've been talking about, those things tend to get undone when the next right-wing government takes power one way or another. So, on paper, he's been sentenced to decades in prison, but how much will he actually serve? I mean, like look at Bolivia. Janine Áñez was in jail, but certainly going to get out when the next government comes in.
Yeah. We've got a little bit of a problem here. There we go. Okay. Well, you just brought up, oops, well, it's doing it again. Okay. Let's just go here. You brought up Haiti briefly there, and we did have a kind of question. Most of our analysis that we've been talking about has really not focused very much on the case of what's going on also in the in the Caribbean. We were just talking about Cuba, and I would encourage viewers, listeners to go check out an episode of Guerrilla History where we talked about the sanctions regime based on chapters from the book Sanctions as War with Helen Yaffe and her chapter on Cuba. And that's a great resource, and she is a great scholar, on that. But we had this question here also about Haiti. Why is it often left out of discussions regarding Latin America's collaboration with U.S. imperialism? And, one could say that about some of the other islands in the Caribbean, but specifically Haiti. And it just reminds me also of another reason to really criticize Lula was that, he really collaborated on these kind of so-called, in humanitarian interventions, trying to, get involved and act like, a regional power, and by going along with the same kind of approach towards Haiti that has subjected it to occupation, intervention, interference, and so on. So, that's maybe a good transition to just talk a little bit about Haiti and about some of the other countries in the Caribbean.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead, Drew.
No, go ahead, Alex. It's fine. It's fine.
I was just gonna tell Dom that not in my classes. In my classes on Latin American history, Haiti is always at the center for a variety of different reasons, but more important reasons, beginning with the fact that South America might have never gotten their independence had it not been for Haiti. So just a little, Easter egg for those of you who want to research more about how Haiti gave Simón Bolívar safe haven after one of his defeats before he went back to South America to win against Spanish colonialism. It is really Haiti's. I would highly recommend the work of Professor Jemima Pierre. Her work on Haiti is extremely valuable and important. So definitely check her work out. I know it wasn't just Lula either. I think when Haiti, which is still suffering imperial control for having had the temerity to seek an anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-slavery revolution in the late early 1800s, is still suffering as a consequence of that. But more recently, it wasn't just Lula in Brazil who worked for U.S. policy against Haitian national sovereignty and self-determination. Andrés Manuel López Obrador did as well in Mexico. He also played a key role in developing and pushing some of these more recent occupation plans to deal with the so-called gang problem in Haiti, that in many ways is fueled by oligarchs based in the U.S. who are sending U.S. weaponry onto the island. I think from López Obrador's perspective, he was trying to figure out a way to prevent Haitian migrants and refugees from leaving that island and coming to Mexico. And that was for me one of the more unforgivable things he did as president of Mexico. So again, instead of working towards some sort of regional solidarity to think about how to best assist Haiti in achieving and maintaining its national sovereignty and self-determination, López Obrador worked more along the type of U.S. anti-migrant policies that have been around for a long time, but we're really pushing someone like AMLO after 2018 to enact, to prevent more Haitian refugees from coming into Mexico on their way, so they could attempt to cross into United States. So it's not just Lula. We can spread the blame around to other large swaths of Latin America, when again, if they had a little bit of historical consciousness, Haiti should be receiving the thanks of at least the former colonies of Spain for having helped them achieve independence in the 1820s.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Also, I mentioned that Maduro in his recent press conference, he mentioned exactly what you're talking about, how the huge debt that Latin America owes to Haiti for the help given to Bolivar. And of course, during the 2004 coup in Haiti that Lula supported and so many other Latin American leaders supported, but Lula took the lead. He supplied the largest contingent of troops to the MINUSTA occupation forces. So that's why he's deservedly singled out for most of the blame there. But Venezuela, of course, under Chavez did not, and neither did Cuba. So that also kind of takes the excuses away from people who say, "Oh, what could he do?" No. And again, why couldn't they have a unified? Why couldn't they have a good unified supporting Haiti and Venezuela and Cuba all together to reject that coup? And yeah, that was Haiti. Just other things. That book. Jamina, I'm familiar with her. I used to hear a lot on Twitter. I don't know what happened. Is she still active on Twitter? No,
Maybe not.
But another great book, one of my favorite books of all time, is The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. So it's about the Haitian Revolution. It's amazing. It'll knock you. If you haven't read it, it'll blow you away. So yeah.
It has such good quotes. Yeah. Like he was so good at the one-liner, C.L.R. James. He has one line from that book that I try to like post once a month or so, where he wrote, "The rich are only defeated when they're running for their lives." Like, it's such a good quote. And it's like, but it's also like a very deep, like, his philosophy of history embedded in that idea that I think is completely accurate. Right. So yeah, that's a great book, Joe.
Yeah, that's a great book. Definitely recommend people check out Black Jacobins. And I want to point out that we do have an episode in Guerrilla History about a play that C.L.R. James wrote. Before he wrote Black Jacobins, and this was only recently discovered, like in the last decade and a half or so, and was edited and published. And so it's very new to people who are familiar with his work in Black Jacobins. But he wrote a play that dramatized the Haitian Revolution and focused around, of course, the charismatic leader figure Toussaint Louverture. And it was apparently performed, but it hasn't really, gotten that much attention. But there were an artist graphic novel was produced, which I think is actually a very good way to tell the story of the Haitian Revolution, probably better than a play, because it's very difficult to get all those extras and so on, but to give a sort of visual sense. So for young people as well, this is a story of world historical significance. We hear about the French Revolution, and of course, in North America, we're always, propagandized about the so-called American Revolution. We should all remember, that it could also be characterized as the counter-revolution of 1776, like our friend and colleague Gerald Horne, has taught us. But the Haitian Revolution is really perhaps the most important of these, and particularly for those of us who are engaged in anti-colonial and anti-imperial and anti-racism struggle. The Haitian Revolution is a touchstone for so many important developments. So I would encourage people to go check out this graphic novel titled Toussaint Louverture that is based on the play of C.L.R. James, and acquaint yourself with that, really important history.
Was Paul Robeson involved with that play?
He was. All right. In fact, was. So it's just such a great story, because it brings together luminaries, and also the environment of what colonial era and early post-colonial era Britain was like, because people from all over, were coming to London, and elsewhere in the UK. And so there was a very vibrant kind of Black, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial culture that expressed itself in the arts. And CLR James was right in the middle of it, and Paul Robeson was, in fact, actually, as you're pointing out, the lead.
Danny Glover was making a movie, but I don't know what happened, if it ever got made. I knew he was working on one.
Yeah, I'd heard that too, and that would be a great resource in popular culture.
It was. I'm not sure if he ever got off the ground.
Well, maybe there's just not financing for.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
I wonder why we can't have a film about the Haitian Revolution. I joke with my students. I'm like, can you guys imagine if they made a movie about the Haitian Revolution that's styled like the movie 300? Mm-hmm. Like, imagine a movie like that, but it's like a bunch of like slaves turned into revolutionaries killing white plantation owners. Like, what kind of impact that could have? I mean, it could generate some interesting political debates within the U.S. Yeah, but I think I think there's something there as to why a movie like this hasn't been made. But.
Yeah, perhaps there is an explanation after all. But well, we're at 90 minutes, and we usually go, about 90 minutes in office hours. It's a Friday night, and people may be off to go do things this evening, and so on. But I'm so grateful that so many people have come into the chat to listen, to engage, to share their views, pose their questions. It's really enriched this dialogue and discussion with two great guests. And so before we conclude, I'm wondering if, either of you or both of you might have any just sort of final thoughts to make, if we're trying to sum up, like, what are the kind of key points we should take away. This is office hours, so we do want everybody who leaves office hours to come away with a few good, important key points they can take away into the rest of their evening and weekend. How should we understand the manifest empire, U.S. In Latin America at this particular juncture? Maybe just a couple concluding thoughts, takeaway points.
Who do you want to
go ahead, Joe?
Yeah, I would just say an empire in decline is very dangerous. Even though it's declining, not going away, it doesn't look like. I hope to be wrong, but it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. And despite its relative decline, it's extremely dangerous. And just don't. When you look at what it's capable of doing in Latin America, don't just consider what it's doing in the rest of the world. It's not going to reinvent the wheel. If it's getting away with decapitation strikes in West Asia all over the place, if Obama can get away with extrajudicial executions all over West Asia, why wouldn't they bring that to the Americas? Why wouldn't they bring that to Africa? Why wouldn't they bring it anywhere else? Right? If they can. So that's what's horrifying, and what you have to try to oppose however you can.
Great point.
Yeah, it's a great point, Joe. I would just add that we are able. I would urge people to keep in mind that connection between what U.S. empire looks like right now in the Caribbean, in Venezuela, and connect it to what's happening domestically with the exercise of colonial policing internally with these roundups and attacks on migrants and undocumented peoples. They're both part of the same process. In many instances, they're being waged by similar military and security apparatuses, definitely using the same logics, right? So this is the idea. Thank you to Aimé Césaire for developing the idea of the imperial boomerang. It's constantly flying back and forth, back and forth. And I think right now is one of those moments where we can really see the empire abroad manifesting itself as colonial policing internally within the U.S. And it's a scary time. It's a really precarious time, both within the region of Latin America, but also internally within the U.S.
Absolutely spot on, brilliant summations of the key points. I'm so grateful to both of you, Joe and Alex, for spending time with my audience and really educating people on this important, timely topic and the broader analysis that connects it with the other kinds of issues and themes we've been discussing here in office hours, about what's happening in West Asia and so forth. I think this has been a really helpful and beneficial discussion. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank all the listeners. And before you leave the stream, you can give it a like and share it. People can watch it back even if they didn't get a chance to be part of this really vigorous dialogue and discussion. They can still benefit afterwards. So like it, get it onto the algorithm. This is a weekly stream. Hopefully we'll be back again next week, Friday, for office hours. Until that time, peace with justice and solidarity. Thanks, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.